to academicians, senior bureaucrats, research scholars, students, activists, one and all. I, on behalf of Tribal Connect, extend you a warm welcome for our today's webinar. Tribal Connect is an NGO registered working for the empowerment of tribal community, and we have come up with this webinar series with an aim to spread awareness on issues pertaining to tribal rights. For our today's webinar, we have with us Mr. Gunjan Singh, advocate practicing at the Supreme Court of India. Advocate Gunjan Singh is a popular name and probably requires no introduction in the domain of human rights lawyering. Still, I would like to take this opportunity to say a few words in his honor. Advocate Gunjan Singh is currently serving as the Director Litigation at Human Rights Law Network Delhi. Human Rights Law Network is India's the most active human rights program, and they have wide network of lawyers spread across the country, fighting litigation almost on daily basis, defending rights of the poor, vulnerable, and the marginalized section of the society. Advocate Gunjan Singh has completed his BLLB honors from Aligarh Muslim University and Masters in Social Work from Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai. For his exceptional leadership in the domain of human rights advocacy, he was awarded the prestigious Chevening Scholarship to study LLM in Human Rights, Conflict and Justice at SOS University of London. He has been instrumental in many significant human rights litigation which have defended the rights of the tribal community. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you, sir, for our today's webinar. And thank you so much for choosing this topic of contemporary relevance. Before going ahead with the webinar, just a small request to the participant. If you have any doubt, any query, just drop it in the chat box so that we can take it up probably after the webinar is delivered, and we can probably have a discussion. Over to you, sir. Please take it forward.
Thank you, Purban, for inviting me on this important topic of forced displacement, land acquisition, and tribal rights in India. India today is also witnessing a predatory loot of resources through different mechanisms, particularly land acquisition for developmental projects. And it has resulted into displacement of millions of Adivasis, so known as tribes. The developmental projects had contributed extensively in the illegal acquisition of land and further forced displacement of Adivasis. In this neoliberal era, scholarship suggests that development model itself is faulty and suffers from many limitations. India took this path in 1991. David Harvey, a noted scholar, argues that accumulation by dispossession is promoted through neoliberal agenda. There is a continuous attempt through privatization of resources and state redistribution of capital. There has been a number of protests against many development projects throughout India and mostly in Adivasi regions. Yet development remains one of the most favorite topic and desired concept in the field. Now, before I go into the legal part of this lecture, I would like to talk about what does land mean for a tribal or Adivasi community. Adivasi or tribes have long agitated and resisted to defend their lands from outside forces. These outside forces are state corporate actors or simply zamindars who have tried to encroach lands of Adivasis. Scholars have documented the contentious relationship between the Adivasi and the outside forces from pre-Mughal era and continues until now. The Adivasi or the tribal way of living revolves around land forests they inhabit, which is popularly known as, in most of the regions, particularly in central India, that the movement of Jal, Jangal and Zameen. For the Adivasi, land does not mean a place where they have built their huts or place. They carry agricultural activity. It also has spiritual, aesthetic, cultural, and social value. I do not want to deny the fact that land has also economic value. Adivasi and their generations have carried out subsistence agriculture and collected forest produce for sustenance from these lands, forests, rivers, and ponds. For example, when an Adivasi loses a jackfruit tree or a mango tree, they lose an important source of food they have consumed for generations. As I mentioned, that land and forest have spiritual, aesthetic, cultural, and social value for a tribal and Adivasi life. The Adivasi festivals, songs, stories, dances, etc. revolve around the centrality of the environment, forest, wild animals, and lands they inhabit. In these stories, songs, and dances, Adivasis continuously enumerate the essentiality of nature's environment, lands, and forests, rivers, and ponds to sustain and preserve Adivasi ways of being. Adivasi and tribes believe in sustainable way of life where they take from nature as much as they need to sustain themselves. The rationale is to ensure the forest and environment are preserved as they are important for Adivasi and community existence. Adivasi and tribes often emphasize the importance of land and forest crucial for their existence. For example, in many of my discussions, Adivasis have mentioned that if these lands and forests are taken away from us, will not exist. To put it simply, what they mean by this is land and forests are a crucial part of who they are and their identity. The Adivasi communal and self-governance system are also based on preserving the environment and nature. Coming to the spiritual aspect of land, forest, rivers, and ponds for the Adivasi communities, I simply want to ask one question to all of you today. When any temple, gurudwara, or a mosque is destroyed during land acquisition, we hear a lot of hue and cry. But how many of us know that these forests and trees are sacred and a spiritual part of Adivasi life and culture? For example, the Adivasi worship sal tree. They believe that the spirit they worship, the Bhonga, lived near the sal tree. So when the land acquisition takes place, many of these sacred worships are also destroyed. In the famous case of Koil Karo Andolan in Jharkhand in 1990s, Adivasis were not just losing land and forest during the construction of the hydroelectricity dam, but they were also losing several of the sacred worship places, what they refer as Bonga. Similarly, in Niyamgiri Hills, Adivasis protested against the land acquisition by Orissa Mining Corporation for private company that is Vedanta. More recently in Jharkhand, Adivasis protested against the land bank policy of state of Jharkhand, which resulted into famous Pathalgadi movement, where 30,000 villages were charged with sedition, which is a glaring example of state repression in independent India. In this respect, it becomes of utmost importance that when we approach land acquisition in the context of Adivasi or tribe, we simply do not see land and forest as just a way of economic means, but recognize them as an important part of the Adivasi and tribal communities' social fabric and their identity. The importance of land and forest in Adivasi life explains why Adivasis have been continuously resisting to defend their lands and forests. Before I go on discussing the legal aspect of a planned acquisition, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of my partner, Pallavi Raunka, who is a research scholar of Adivasi studies, and Devashish Kelkar, a law student, in the conceptualization of today's lecture. Now, the next part of my lecture, I will be talking about principle of eminent domain, which is a tool for land acquisition by the state actors. The principle of eminent domain in general parlance means power of the government to take property of an individual for the public purpose or interest or in the interest of public at large. This is often justified by the state, which promises to achieve the goal of Vikas. Vikas, as development is popularly known in Hindi, has remained a guiding principle for our usage of terms like progress and growth in India and has different dimensions. The idea that the economic growth is prime indicator of development has been a hello. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, you are audible now, sir. Yes.
Okay.
Please.
Yet economic growth remains central to the debate, is often desired goal of many developing nations. Every economy in this world aims for growing fast through various developmental projects. There has been, of course, great progress in terms of economy, and such projects have contributed extensively, but at the same time, history is marked by exodus of marginalized population and resistance from them in various parts of the world, particularly Adivasis. Such narrow understanding at policy level and skewed consideration of the laws has caused discontentment among project affected people, particularly Adivasis, which has further culminated into different forms of resistance and often violence as well. Recent incidents of violence and protest against forced land acquisition and legal developments in India, like passing of a Special Economic Zones Act and right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation and resettlement Act 2013, testifies the gravity of the situation. The question of land being acquired by the state is one of the most contested concepts. It has a long history and its roots are in colonial period. It was only during the colonial times that common property resources were made state subjects through state apparatus. For the first time in the history of India, a major change in the land relations was brought up by Britishers through Permanent Settlement Act 1793. Through this act, zamindari system was established and land was made subject of the state which claimed its sovereignty over land. Legal instruments such as the Land Acquisition Act, the erstwhile 1894 Act, facilitated such process of state-sponsored acquisition of land. Different resources like forest, land, water bodies, etc., which hitherto were used by the people, became the property of the state. This shift in the relation where state became owner of the natural resources and land is crucial to understand the impact of colonialism on contemporary developmental policies. In post-colonial period, little change was made in legal and administrative framework. There was merely a shift of power from dominion to republic, and little was done to address existing structural inequalities which was deeply rooted in our society. The doctrine of eminent domain is still applied on same name of national interest, and it lays ground for land acquisition. Such sovereignty of state and its interventionist approach have been continuously questioned and challenged by Adivasis. Recent incidents like Pathalgadi movement in Jharkhand highlights the anger and anxiety among Adivasis against forceful acquisition by the state, which acquired land for private industries, citing public purpose. Displacement. Wide range of scholarship on displacement suggests that it has been an integral constitutive component of the development process. Though displacement and development may seem to be contradictory terms, but they are cruel facts of our developmental regime and are more astonishing than our fictions. One of the powerful legal mechanisms deployed for displacement is eminent domain. Different scholarship on the subject view displacement differently. Some consider displacement as a necessary evil of development and an inevitable outcome of development. So they argue for a better rehabilitation policy aimed at sustainable employment. So there is this one school of thought which believes this. And the other group considers displacement as a manifestation of crisis in development in itself at the policy level. Latter view has been mostly articulated by many activists and has been used against most of the projects. Parshuraman, a noted scholar on displacement induced by the development projects, argues that there lies structural biases in the development policies, which favors minority and majority pays the price. The fruits of such development projects. Displacement is not merely loss of household, but there are dimensions of displacement and it has wide repercussions. As I mentioned earlier, that from Adivasi way of living, it is not only about that how the land is being acquired and how these lands have economic value. Cernia, another scholar who has studied displacement, argues that risk of poor people getting poorer after displacement is higher, and it applies in the case of Adivasis and tribals as well. He has in detail explained interlinked potential risk, which is intrinsic in development. Mining-induced displacement is one of the major challenges in today's world, with growing mining activities across the globe. Another noted scholar, Tominski, explains that mining-induced displacement is a global socio-economic issue and poses a great challenge to human rights issue. The social cost of the exploitation is a major concern, and loss of physical assets is secondary to it. As I have mentioned, the socio-cultural value of land and forest for Adivasis. The mining industry have caused displacement of almost 1.5 million in the past 50 years, particularly in Jharkhand region. However, the numbers are not accurate and are believed to be much more. The displacement remains one of the most feared consequences of such big projects. Now let us go to the next aspect, that what are the laws relating to tribal rights in India and how Supreme Court has looked into it. One of the most important safeguards provided by the law, clearly not followed in the above example, is the prerequisite of consent prior to any governmental projects, development projects on tribal lands. And one can see that there is a common pattern across India in different regions, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, and in other tribal belts, that often tribals have been fighting against the forceful land acquisition. And the main grievance is that they were not consulted. And these regions, being the hub of natural resources, mining, have become a center of contestation between state and the tribals. On one hand side, there's the school of thought which believes that if there are natural resources in these areas, they have to be extracted. State has to meet the economic end, and the developmental projects will have to be carried out so that state achieves its economic justice. But the question here is that at what cost? And what are the promises which have been made to tribals in India under Indian constitutional framework? Now we have seen that over the years, different statutes have been enacted, different laws have been framed, which recognize the principle of self-determination and the tribals' right to decide the governance system in the area. According to the Right to Fair Compensation Act, Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement 2013, and PISA Act 1996, and even the Forest Rights Act 2006, any project plan on areas belonging to scheduled tribes can be done only in consultation and with consent of the Gram Sabha and Panchayats of the region. As I mentioned earlier, that in almost all the cases, one see a pattern that these projects are being carried out, are being finalized at the very higher echelons of the power structure in our Indian politics. Often, no prior consultations are made, and once these projects are finalized, the state with all its apparatus, the district electorate level, panchayat level, police, and even other mechanism, they are applied in full force to evict tribals from their areas in order to acquire this land for the so-called developmental projects. The logic behind this is quite simple. The tribal people are heavily dependent on their land for sustainable life as they know it. And at the same time, these resources are situated there and the state wants them. Now, if the central authorities are allowed to take away tribal land without the consent of the inhabitants, it would almost certainly destroy and uproot their lives. The Supreme Court, in the case of Orissa Mining Corporation versus the Ministry of Environment and Forest and others, reiterated this principle. This case concerned the eviction of certain forest dwellers in Orissa and primarily dealt with the Forest Rights Act of 2006. The court strongly emphasized the fact that the Gram Sabhas and local panchayat would have to voluntarily allow any government projects in the forest lands. Although the judgment is specific to the forest lands and tribes and was passed prior to the 2013 Act, the principle enshrined herein remains good in law and spirit with regards to the acquisition of tribal lands for the purpose of development. Now, the landmark case, which highlights the importance of Gram Sabha and the tribal rights, is Samta. And it would be impossible to engage in a conversation regarding tribal community rights in India without referring to the judgment passed in Samta versus State of Andhra Pradesh. In short, this case arose against the backdrop of the liberalization, wherein the government began to lease out huge mining projects to private corporates. And as I mentioned earlier, that post 1991, we see a whole lot of a liberalization, post liberalization developmental projects coming in. And there's a huge boost in economic growth. These mining projects naturally entailed the destruction of several important geocultural sites and also tribal villages. Samta took up the cause of these people and challenged the lease granted. The following judgment of the Supreme Court is widely considered to be the pinnacle of tribal rights in Indian judiciary. A good portion of the judgment focuses on material aspect of the land acquisition of tribal areas and how it must be regulated. However, the remarkable feature of this judgment lies in its attitude and intent towards tribal rights. Specifically, Judge K. Ramaswamy included an often overlooked right in the context of tribal rights acquisition, the right to life under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. It has long been established that Article 21 includes the right to holistic development and the freedom to do so. This judgment makes the point that these rights cannot be enjoyed by tribal people unless their lands are conserved, and hence bringing the right to protect their lands under the ambit of Article 21. Further, the Supreme Court recognized the importance and the role of the Gram Sabha and affirmed their power to make decisions on important matters that concern the livelihood of the tribal people. For this reason, the Samta judgment has been widely recognized as a weapon of the weak and has become an impediment in the path of agencies and corporations which aim to take the possession over such land. Next, we turn our attention to regional acts, which also contain similar provisions to impede the government in land acquisition of scheduled tribe lands. Most acts contain a stipulation intended to regulate or abolish the transfer of tribal land to non-tribal entities. Like in Jharkhand, there is Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act, popularly known as CNT Act, Santhal Pargana Act, SPT Act, and Land Transfer Regulation Act of Andhra Pradesh specifically abolishes this practice, where transfer of land from tribals to non-tribals. However, the Madhya Pradesh Land Revenue Code of 1959 contained a provision which was worded somewhat differently. This act states that the Bhumi Swami of a tribal person shall not be transferred either by way of sale or otherwise. Bhumi Swami is title. If one were to follow the principles and interpretation theme in the Samta judgment, it would be abundantly clear that the intent of this legislation was to prohibit the transfer of land to any non-tribal entities, as this would be detrimental to the interest of the tribal people. Now, next is the judgment delivered in Balco Employees versus Union of India, which somehow started a new jurisprudence and, however, digressed from and casted doubt upon the Samta judgment, a mere 5 years after the latter was passed. While the adjudicating upon the subject of transfer of land to Balco by the state government by way of lease, the court held that content of the MP Land Revenue Code differed from Andhra Pradesh Land Transfer Regulation Act in the sense that AP Act specifically prohibits any form of transfer of land, while the MP Act does not contain any such prohibition on the lease of tribal lands. Now, Balco was a case where divestment of Balco was happening, and that was challenged by the workers. It was on this basis that the court concluded that the Samta judgment cannot apply in Balco. The judges even casted doubt as to whether the majority opinion in Samta was correct, but did not go into the specifics of this doubt. Although the acts do differ in wording, it seems abundantly clear that the court simply did not apply the same mindset as the bench in Samta. Had the court thought about it from the tribal rights perspective, they would have realized that the long-term industrial leases can be just as harmful to tribal people as the sale of land. Keeping this in mind, we can conclude that this judgment dealt the first major blow to the power held by the Samta. The noteworthy, though process applied in Samta, was further diluted in state of MP versus Narmada Bachao Andolan in 2011, when the court had to consider the displacement caused by the Omkareshwar Dam project, and which also Narmada Bachao Andolan has been a very popular movement in India, led by Medha Patekar. The residents of 30 different villages had been affected due to the dam project, and nearly 5 of them were submerged when the litigation was ongoing in the High Court. In the Supreme Court, the judgment delivered deviated from one of the most crucial aspects of Samta judgment, the right to life under Article 21. While in Samta, the court made a clear connection between tribal land rights and Article 21. The Narmada Bachao judgment clearly stated that the acquisition of tribal land does not violate the right to livelihood under Article 21. The court acknowledged the importance of the right to fair compensation, but vehemently opposed the contention that acquisition of land can be a violation of Article 21 for tribal people. Now, this whole focus on compensation is a very, controversial aspect. That how do you actually assess the damage done? And I draw a parallel from labor laws perspective also, because I also specialize in the field of labor laws, where you have seen that how after protracted litigation, in most of the cases, when the termination of an employee is held to be illegal, courts have often taken this stand that some compensation should be given, but reinstatement back to the services cannot be given. And it is a totally fair thing to say that damages can be provided in terms of illegal termination cases also, even though courts or industrial tribunals have held that the termination is illegal. Similarly here, when you say that if compensation is rightly paid, it is totally fine to acquire land and force people away from the region. Now, after a long history of violence, resistance, movement, we see somewhere in 2013 that there's a more focus on rehabilitation and resettlement package. But often in my interaction with people in the region, and particularly in tribal region, one would often ask the question that show me a one example that where people were asked to vacate their land, state acquired land, and a good resettlement package was given to them, and they have been rehabilitated and they are happy. The fact of the matter today is there is none. You do not have a single example that you can quote in a tribal area that see, here we have done, that this is the perfect example, and this is what we'll do in your area. So the lack of trust and some sort of a mistrust against the state is very much rooted in its historical injustice and the experience of tribals post-independence particularly, that where lands have been taken for mega projects and they have been fighting for years, and there is no example that they have been resettled or resettlement package was done properly. So this is the experience of tribal people that which often is reflected in their movement, in their resistance against any attempt to acquire land, more particularly in the central India. Now, I'd also like to talk a little bit more about international perspective, that how courts in different countries have looked upon this debate of who owns the land and how these lands should be governed. Undoubtedly, this practice of land acquisition in tribal areas is common across the world. Not only are the legal rights of the tribal people violated, as in the broader picture, one can easily see that their moral right to live their own life is also taken away. To demonstrate the ideal state of autonomy in tribal areas, we turn to the nation of Panama. More specifically, the Nassau people of Panama, whose lands for decades have been under the protection of the state government. The government in this case set up a national park and forest reserves in these areas and maintained full control over them. The Nassau people not only sought the right to manage their own lands, but also believed that these lands could not be protected well by government officials sitting hundreds of miles away. Now, this is a very interesting concept and a debate, because even in India, we today, this is often argued and often debated that who knows, who understands the best interest of the people and the environment. And I'll talk later about the pending case in the Supreme Court today, which is Wildlife First versus Union of India, where often some environmentalist group have argued that in forest areas, mostly in tribal areas also, that huge degradation of environment is being done and people residing there are responsible. I do not say that there is no iota of truth in it, but Are tribals responsible? Are forest dwellers responsible for degradation of environment? Certainly not, because there is a lot of corruption in the area. The deforestation is done at the behest of state officials, and this is not a secret. But coming back to the Nassau case, the Panama case, Nassau people not only sought the right to manage their own lands, but also believed that these lands could not be protected well by the government officials sitting hundreds of miles away. When approached with this issue, the Supreme Court came up with a solution which appears quite radical. The court decided in favor of the Nassau people and granted them the power to manage their entire 400,000-acre territory as a semi-autonomous territory, completely under the purview of themselves. The Nassau people have their own native language and even practice monarchy among their ranks. Effectively, this entire region has become a Nassau mini kingdom. The significance of this judgment is not in the ultimate award, but the fact that the court recognized tribal people are the best candidate to manage and control their own land, a strain of thought evident in the Samta judgment. Although the Nassau case does not deal specifically with the acquisition of land for development, the principle derived from the judgment can certainly be applied in those situations. Now, in post-independence India, this debate has often resurfaced that how do we integrate tribals within the mainstream? How do we strike a balance between the mining resources in the forest areas and how do we carry development projects? And at the same time, how do we maintain that the local custom, rituals, way of living of tribals are protected? And this we have seen that it is a contested debate. Coming back to the next case at the global level, the next case in hand concerns forced evictions and comes to us from the International American Court of Human Rights. In Moiwana community versus Suriname, the court during its judgment had to consider whether a particular piece of land belonged to Moiwana tribal community or the state. Initially, it was recognized that there was no formal title held by any individuals over that piece of land, which would normally mean the state was its formal owner. Now, even today in India, you will often see that in cases where there are natural reserves, mineral resources, in these cases, it is totally the prerogative of the state to acquire land. So initially, it was recognized that there was no formal title held by any individuals over that piece of land, which would normally mean that the state was its formal owner. However, the court recognized that the Moiwa community had occupied these ancestral lands in accordance with customary practices for decades, and hence decreed that it should be given official possession of the land. Next is the Quechua indigenous people of Saraki versus Ecuador, which similarly takes a very progressive approach on the recognition of rights. This judgment endorses the idea that the tribal people have always rightly possessed their own land, but the law has been slow to recognize it. Now, this is a very interesting concept, which you'll see that it often the tune of the Forest Rights Act 2006, that it does not decide the title, it only recognizes it when it gives the patta. Specifically, the need to move away from the classical colonial definitions of what constitutes a title to a piece of land. Instead of considering solely the land records, one can consider cultural evidences such as folklore, oral testimonies, ancient cultural writings, etc. Recognizing these forms of evidence would help tribal people assert control over their lands. In the context of acquisition by the government for the developmental purpose, this judgment by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights reiterated the importance of genuine consultation with the residents of the land. In fact, this concept is enshrined in international law as a jus cogens norm, known as free informed prior consent. This concept was formed the basis of land acquisition cases around the world. Both the aforesaid mentioned cases have another common principle which needs to be applied in India. This is the differentiation between a law that promises secure land rights versus a law that practices it. In India and around the world, legislation towards forest and indigenous people have become more progressive in nature. However, the lack of an implementation mechanism which suits the current cultural practices of the indigenous people is missing. Now, this is broadly the legal understanding of the subject. But the question here is that it is only the problem of implementation of the law, or the problem lies somewhere else. Now, as I started my lecture, I gave a brief introduction about how do we see, how do we perceive development, and what do we consider development. And the answer lies somewhere there, that the policies which the state makes, the thrust on developmental projects, mining, is somewhat misplaced, in the sense that what kind of development do we want? Do we consider pristine environment, preserving these environment forests as very much essential? And if that is so, then why we see in India today that almost in every tribal dominated areas, you have huge developmental projects coming in, which not only degrades forest, but natural resources like river, and obviously the local practices, customs of tribals in India. Now, how do we see today this debate? Is it some sort of it is going to decrease the state intervention and the forced acquisition is going to stop? Has it decreased from what it was earlier, or has it increased? Now, to my mind, in the coming years, this is going to increase, because the kind of development model we have chosen, and this will be very much reflected in the recent move, and more particularly during COVID, we see there are some amendments made in the acts relating to this subject, like the recent amendment in Mines and Minerals Act 1957, which allows private companies to mine coal for commercial purpose. Now, this is a departure from the existing norm, where it was only that private companies could mine coal for public purpose. But now this has been opened up. There's a free hand that private companies can mine coal for commercial purposes. And there's a case pending right now, which I'm involved in, is the coal mining case in the Supreme Court, where state of Jharkhand has, where government of India has planned to auction 6 coal mines in Jharkhand, then also in the other states. But first is Jharkhand, which is coming up. It poses huge threat to the pristine environment and opens up mining for private companies. If you'll see that all the 6 blocks of coal blocks which are situated in Jharkhand, there's a threat to the elephant corridor, there's a river flowing in, all that is going to dry up. All those forests are being cleared. And right now the Supreme Court had, though allowed the auction, but it has passed an order stating that all the steps carried out by these companies shall be subject to the outcome of the case. So as of now, the step of clearing the forest has not started, but we fear that it is going to start soon. Now, another case which I referred earlier in my lecture was Wildlife First versus Union of India, which is one of the most hotly debated topic in India, is that the rights of forest dwellers. And Supreme Court in February 2019 passed an order directing eviction of millions of tribals on the ground that their claims were rejected by the local authorities. Interestingly, the case was filed by an environment group. The respondent was Union of India, but the orders which were passed were against tribals and they were not before the court. Immediately thereafter, there was huge uproar that this is the order which is going to evict millions of tribals. Many tribal rights organizations intervened in the Supreme Court, and central government then came and said that it is a mistake, we are going to stay. And then Supreme Court, upon this assurance of the central government, Supreme Court had to stay this order. But the question here again is that who knows how to manage land in tribal areas? whose responsibility it is and whose rights are there. State believes that all these areas they can intervene, they can acquire land, and tribals still believe that they have been governing these areas in harmony with nature for years. Now, how minings have posed a huge risk, and particularly in tribal states. Another example which comes to my mind is Adani power plant case, where in one of the district named Godda in Jharkhand, Adani is establishing a huge power plant. It has acquired almost 1,300-acre land. And interestingly, the power which will be produced in that power plant and all the electricity will be transmitted to Bangladesh 100%. All the electricity shall be transmitted to Bangladesh. Coal for the purpose of that power plant is being brought by Australia. And Jharkhand remains one of those states where coal is being mined. And I would like to end my lecture with this last observation, that what is the central to this whole debate is the power of the Gram Sabha, which is very much essential, which was a result of a historic struggle, and recognition of power of Gram Sabha was the result of long-standing struggle of Adivasi movement and recognition of self-determination rights of tribals in the Indian Constitution. Today, what we see that this right, the power of the Gram Sabha and the power of the Gram Sabha to decide for themselves is at risk. The Pathalgadi case, which I mentioned in Jharkhand, where it is a shame that in an independent India, 30,000 people were charged with sedition, including women, child. FIR was lodged against whole villages. The case is pending in the Supreme Court. People were charged with sedition for sharing newspaper clippings. The tribals who believed in this practice of Pathalgadi. Pathalgadi is a traditional practice in the state of Jharkhand, where tribals carve on a stone and they put, and it was essentially started as a tribal practice of commemorate their elderly. And then they started writing provisions of Indian Constitution. I went to some villages and I saw that they have written provisions of the Indian Constitution on a green stone and the provisions of Indian Constitution, and these stones are carved. And they are asking that the promises which you have made under Indian Constitution, please follow that. There's nothing new which we are asking, but the promise of the Indian state that Gram Sabha shall have supremacy in terms of deciding at the local level, that should be granted. Today, tribals are not being asked. The state of Jharkhand had this practice of land bank policy where they acquired land and that will be given to industries to set up, companies to set up industries. I mean, these are the contestation. So the heart of the matter and the debate lies in the dilution of the power of the Gram Sabha, which is a right, which is a result of the long-standing struggle of Adivasis, and it is a promise made under Indian Constitution. So today we must ask this question, that what model of development do we want? And the promises which the Indian state under Indian have made in the Indian Constitution, are we going to keep this promise? Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Purban, I'm audible?
Yes, sir. You're audible, sir. Can you hear me now?
Prabyan, unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for this comprehensive, thought-provoking lecture, sir. It was really you've thrown up in so many dimensions to think about, and the perspectives that you gave, it was really an eye-opener, sir. It was really a great learning lesson and a great session for me, sir. Thanks once again. So, with your permission, sir, there are a few questions. So, can we take that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, the first question that we have is from Tanay. He's asking, is there a way we can convert tribal land for development purpose if it's absolutely necessary and there is no alternative at all? So he's basically asking, is there a way at all, sir? So if
You
there
know,
is no alternative at all.
I remember I studied Master in Social Work in Dalit and Tribal Studies at TISS Mumbai. And this question, I asked exactly this question. I asked one of my professor, Virginius Khakha, who specializes in tribal studies. And I asked, but how do you achieve this development? We need land for development. And at the same time, how can we do that? And it was a class attended by almost 500, 600 people. And he just said one line, I don't know. You ask tribals. So the first question is that, do you have a model? The promises which you have made, are you going to think from this perspective of a state that you need land? But what about thinking from this perspective that people who have inhabited those land, do you have an answer for them? And as I said, you don't have a single example in independent India where you can show that you have acquired land in a tribal area, you have made a resettlement package, and people are happy. All you see today is that land has been acquired. People who are master of their land have become security guards in those companies which have been established on those land. You see across India, you'll see mining companies coming in, coal companies coming in. The local tribals and landless people who were granted land would be working as security guards in those companies. It is happening everywhere. So I don't
True, sir.
know.
Very true.
Ask this question to people who are inhabiting those land. What answer do they have?
Right, sir. Right, sir. So the next question that we have is from Ravi Kiran, sir. So he's asking, do you think that the government officials should be held accountable for misuse of Land Acquisition Act, as the people are only being displaced and no further actions regarding rehabilitation and fair compensation for the same being provided? Just basically saying that the procedural safeguards which are there in land acquisition law, which is not being implemented by the bureaucrats, do you think? I mean, how do we rectify that particular problem? Bureaucrats not doing their job. Do you think they should be held accountable, or like how do you reflect on this particular problem? So,
See, there can be no denial about this, that bureaucrats have to be held accountable. There is a huge corruption in the process of land acquisition, how district collectors and district magistrates would turn and how would they define public purpose, how land have been acquired forcefully, money will be deposited in a registry, people will be forced to take that money, how local goons at the behest of police would evict tribals in the region, how whole state machinery will be used. All that is true. But does the solution lies in a proper implementation of the rehabilitation package? Now, in the very start of my lecture, I wanted to draw this attention to this debate, that first of all, are we going to focus on resettlement and rehabilitation, or are we going to first look at our own development model, which does not focus only on rehabilitation and resettlement? Because then you believe that yes, you can evict people from the region and then you will think about where they have to go. I'm trying to argue that you do not focus on rehabilitation, resettlement at the very first stage. First, you must decide the idea of development which the state is trying to choose, whether it is in direct conflict of the nature, whether it is direct conflict with the local custom and spiritual aspect of the local tribal people who have been living in these areas for generations and in harmony with nature. So we must ask these questions, because the debate must not shift on only resettlement and rehabilitation.
right, so very true, so very true. So with that, sir, we have one more question, sir. We have a couple of questions left. So this question is asked by Kavya Nargun. So she is asking that, so you spoke about how there is a shift in judicial approach from tribal centric to development centric. Do you think overwhelming majority at the parliament has contributed to this shift in approach, or perhaps compel judiciary to exercise restraint? How do you
Now,
reflect on this, sir?
see, you'll see that I often say this, that the justice delivery mechanism and the approach in judiciary is a reflection of what is happening in the parliament. A majoritarian government and the judiciary, that relationship needs to be understood. A coalition government, a minority government, and then the relationship of judiciary has to be understood. You'll often see across the globe that often when the majoritarian government passes any law or takes decision, judiciary, with an exception, are almost passing judgments in the line of what the majoritarian government believes in. And India remains no exception.
True, sir. Very true. Very true. Sir, one last question we have from Subhaskar, which is also in the similar line. He's asking that in the initial time of post our independence, judgments from the top court reflected values of human rights. But if you see in the recent times, that is absent. So how do you trace and how do you reason this particular shift? I mean, like, what has been the major reason for this? That's what he's asking.
Can you please repeat? I could not understand the question.
Yeah, sir. So he's saying like post-independence, like after the initial time after our independence, the judgments of the constitutional courts reflected values of human rights, and they sort of advocated and like went ahead to protect the human rights of the citizens. But then in the recent time, that is somewhere lacking. That's his opinion. He's asking, how do you reason this particular shift in trend, like from post-independence era and from to now after 70 years of independence?
See, this is a very loaded statement in the sense that post-independence courts were more respectful of human rights and they are not today. Is a loaded statement, and I don't subscribe to that. You often have judgments even today which would uphold the values of human rights, and they believe in this principle. There are judgments in different phases of Indian judiciary which would, not subscribe to this view of human rights, and they utter disregard of human rights. Now you have many judgments and even the pending cases in the Supreme Court where values of personal freedom and speech and expression is lying for years and no adjudication is being made. So it is difficult to say that how it can be done and judiciary can do it or not. But all I believe in that it is mostly the result of the lot which goes to the Supreme Court. We must ask this question, that who is deciding question for whom? We so far do not have representation from marginalized communities in the Supreme Court. So are we going to believe in the neutrality of the Supreme Court merely by ignoring this aspect? The answer is no. These questions have to be understood, that this perspective, that a tribal perspective has to come in within the mindset of judges as well, which I can say very frankly that is missing.
True, sir. Very true. Very true, sir. And I had a question from my end, sir. So I wanted to ask you, sir, like for young law students like me pursuing law, it becomes like at time difficult for us to get into human rights litigation because of the financial aspect involved. So some of the law schools, they charge so much that we are on education loan. So we have this worry in our head to pay back the education loan. So I study in a government law college, so I don't have that back in my mind. So how do you see this particular aspect? I mean, money and human rights litigation. And how do you see, I mean, like, so I personally want to get into human rights litigation, but how do you, like, inspire other law students who are studying law like me to get into human rights litigation?
See, a very relevant and pertinent question. This question is often asked. And my answer is very simple, that definitely the debate is a larger debate of the whole education policy in India, where higher education is not being subsidized. And you have generations which you are producing, which is burdened with loans. So in that aspect, it is difficult for a lot of people to make this choice. But at the same time, I believe it is not that difficult. All you have to do is to make a choice in life. that what do you want? And the first question is to ask yourself that do you feel angry? For me, that is a test. If you feel angry with whatever is happening around you, then you will find a way out to deal with that. If you don't feel angry with the state of affairs around you, then I think you are happy all those placement agencies and get placed and work peacefully. That is totally fine. Because don't force yourself into something which you are not cut out for. That is not
Right.
to discourage people, but that to encourage people that ask that question to yourself, that do you feel angry with these things or not? And you may be late, you may want to work in the area, you'll work maybe a year later, you will manage something, you'll come back, everything, but you'll find a way out. I was giving a lecture a couple of hours back today itself on labor laws, and I said this to many students from Government Law College Mumbai, that in terms of labor law practice, which we don't see that many people taking up, that it is also a human rights practice. You are fighting for labor rights, that it is one of the most sustainable model. You represent hundreds of workers, you charge them less, you might not have a very fancy fees, but you'll have a decent life. You charge them reasonably, you have bulk of cases that will come to you. So in human rights practice, this is the key, that you charge reasonably and then you see your clientele, it will develop. But if you have some dream of a very fancy, luxurious life, sorry, then this is not the field. But you'll have a decent life, that I can say.
Right, sir. So, I mean, what I gather is that you'll definitely be able to sustain yourself, at least.
Not only
I
sustain, you will
mean,
have
the
a comfortable
perception that
life.
is there. Right, so noted. So, yeah. So, okay, with that, I would like to call upon Vikas sir. So, Vikas sir is a person who has provided us with the platform and the technical support. And he's running this webinar series called Beyond Law CLC. They have conducted more than 300 webinars successfully. He's doing really a great service for the law students and young lawyers out there. He's sort of building a repository of knowledge for all the law students and young lawyers out there. So he has provided us with this particular platform and entire technical support. I want to majorly thank you, sir. And if you're here, sir, if you could like join in and deliver the vote of thanks, that'll be great, sir.
No. Prabyan, it's like when you connected with us, we said that question is only of knowledge sharing. And when you said that, I said that we can always connect with the knowledge regarding the tribal area. This is one of the niche areas where people normally do not get the sessions. Like today, I said, we had one of the sessions, we had Justice Rajiv Bhalla speaking on how do you go about with the 6 session certificate. And at the same time, they had another session after 6:30 by a Guwahati advocate on as to what are the rights under the Indian Succession Act and what are the difference between the Northeast areas. So I was thinking today there was 2 sessions back to back connecting with the somewhat rights of the tribal areas and how to go about it. Mr. Gunjan will have to unmute himself. Yeah. And Mr. Gunjan, you have actually taken up the entire history of as to how you can go across from the old act to the new act of 2013, and its own challenges. Though I would take the flip side of under 2013 act, it's very difficult nowadays to have a acquisition as such. Normally they are taking into the queue like Gamada, etc. out in Punjab. Normally they are asking that you can become a partner of some particular of the land which will be developed, and that's doing much better than the acquisition part as such. But yes, the insights you have given, rather, since I do not know whether you will be sharing, you can share those judgments with Prapan. They can share it on the WhatsApp group. This is normally we follow the pattern, so that those who want to actually follow it up after looking into the YouTube, etc., then they can connect with those judgments and they have that repository of the judgments. And right, like he said, we had a today 302nd webinar in consecutive. And thank you, Gunjan, and thank you to this all team of the Connect Tribals. So it's a wonderful way of connecting with each other, and that too in testing times we have been able to learn as to how we can come on a virtual platform. Everyone is sitting in different parts of the country and learning the knowledge sharing part. Over to you, Pravan.
I'll
Yes,
share
sir.
those judgments with you, Purba, and you can circulate them in your group. I can share that with you.
Definitely.
And
Thank you
thank
so
you
much, sir.
everyone for listening.
I'll be of great help. And thank you so much, sir, for taking your time out. So I must mention that Gunjan sir is probably one of the most busiest lawyers of the country, human rights lawyers of the country. He's traveling like one state to another state. He's attending state meetings, but then despite being his tight schedule, he consented to take his time out and deliver this webinar. I'm thankful to you, sir. And from Tribal Connect, we extend our gratitude to you, sir. Thank you so much for
Thank you,
joining us.
Purba. And there's some sort of a power cut, so my screen has gone black.
No issues, sir. No issues, sir.
Okay.
Right. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Thank you, one
Thank
and
you.
all.